Hello everyone, I am Dimitra Femi. I am Professor of Fantasy and Children's Literature at the University of Glasgow, and I also co-direct the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic here in Glasgow. And this is a brief presentation about the Centre, about our activities, about our research, and all the other public-facing events that we do. So I thought I'd start with a nice photo of our university. You can see the spire there, the very much neo-Gothic sort of building that we're based in. And I think that's quite an opposite place to have a Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic. At the same time, of course, Glasgow is a very modern city. So bringing together the old and the new is one of the things that we also do at the Centre. And I thought it would be a good place to start. Now, the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic was founded in September 2020, but it was built on over 5 years of earlier fantasy-related activities, teaching, research, and public engagement here in Glasgow. So the Centre brought together a number of pre-existing things that we were already doing as a team and consolidated them. And it's our strategic way of sort of looking towards the future. The Centre has a number of aims. First of all, to consolidate a world-leading centre for conducting and disseminating research in fantasy and the fantastic. Second, to attract and educate a diverse cohort of scholars at master's, PhD, DFA and postdoctoral level. Third, to conduct pioneering research projects with external funders and partners. And fourth, to bring together academia and the wider fantasy community, including creators and performers, in order to understand fantasy's transformative intellectual, cultural, and social potential. If you access the Centre's website, and I've put the address at the bottom of the slide here, you will see a number of tiles, a number of areas that show you the kind of things we do, the kind of activities that we undertake. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to take you through all of these tiles, but I won't talk about each of them. There's no time for that in a short presentation. I'll just pick out a few of the flagship projects that we have and key things that we do. So starting first of all with our Fantasy Masters programme. Our Fantasy MLit programme is the world's only master's programme focusing on fantasy, and it was founded in 2015, so it's got a good few years of running and a number of graduates already so far. Our students are part of a vibrant research community, including our staff who are all published researchers working on different aspects of the fantastic, and also a number of PhD students. Our students, the moment they become part of the program, they're also entitled by default to membership of the Centre, so they can take advantage of all of the extracurricular events and projects and opportunities that the Centre affords them, apart from the main programme of taught courses and their research dissertation that they undertake. And talking about events and opportunities via the Centre, these are some of the things we've done over the last few years, including our launch event that featured award-winning fantasy authors and scholars, events that are seasonal, like on Christmas or Halloween, the centenary of David Lindsay's A Voyage to Arcturus, an event on D&D and fantasy fiction, book launches such as Catherine Langrish's book on Narnia, the anniversary of Tolkien's lecture here at the University of Glasgow in 1953, and big conferences like the Once and Future Fantasies Conference in July 2022. So it's too much for me to, and again, I'll give you a flavour here, it's too much for me to talk about everything we've done, but please feel free to look at our website through our past events page and see all the range of activities, including recordings of events. Most of our events have been recorded and are accessible. A lot of our events and research projects have happened in collaboration with internal and external partners. So this slide shows you some of our previous and ongoing collaborations, including with the International Association of the Fantastic in the Arts, with whom we run the big conference in 2022, a number of events with the Tolkien Society, and conference with the Science Fiction Foundation, a collaboration with the University of Queensland on their What If Lab, a number of events as part of the Being Human Festival, which is a UK-wide festival on the arts and humanities. And also we've had funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council here in the UK. And there's now an ongoing collaboration with Glasgow 2024, which is the Worldcon that is coming to Glasgow in the summer of 2024. Some internal partners are Games and Gaming Lab, the Creative Conversations series of events, but also our Medical Humanities Centre and many, many other collaborations with our library and special collections, for example. From this next slide, I'm only going to pick a couple of things, and the first one is GIFCON. GIFCON stands for Glasgow International Fantasy Conversations, and it is our annual fantasy conference in which lots of our masters and PhD students come together to sort of organize it and present possibly for the first time. And GIFCON started in 2017, and over the years it's grown. It's become a truly international event, especially after we had to bring it online during the COVID-19 2020 pandemic. And then we have kept it online since then because a huge international community of fantasy scholars has gathered around it, and we want to make sure it remains accessible to everyone. We've had some amazing keynotes through the years, including, again, award-winning scholars and also creative practitioners from different areas of fantasy creativity, not just literature, but also graphic novels and art and other media, etc. We are already, we've just announced the GIFCON 2024 CFP now, and feel free to put in the paper and join us. Another flagship project that the Centre has helped establish is Perspectives on Fantasy, which is the first ever academic book series on fantasy, published by Bloomsbury Academic and co-edited by Professor Brian Atterbury, myself and Professor Matthew Sangster. There is an exclusive critical focus on fantasy in this series. We're considering both monographs and edited collections, so do consider it if you are working on a book proposal at the moment. You can see also on the slide our very much international and diverse editorial board. And just to give you a sense of the kinds of books we have commissioned and published already, you can see the four titles here. There's many more in the pipeline at the moment, but we've got Taylor Rodriguez's Queering Faith in Fantasy Literature, my own co-edited collection with Alistair Sims, Imagining the Celtic Past in Modern Fantasy, Timothy Murphy's William Hope Hodgson and the Rise of the Weird, and Anahit Bahruz's forthcoming Mapping Middle-earth, Environmental and Political Narratives in J.R.R. Tolkien's Cartographies. So lots of scope for many different approaches and many different themes within the wider umbrella of fantasy and the fantastic. I would also be remiss not to mention our journal for fantasy research, Mapping the Impossible, which is a student-run journal. It is run by our PhD students and recent graduates and early career researchers, not just at Glasgow, but again, a wider community that has gathered around the centre. So this is the sort of front page. This is an online open access journal that accepts papers from PhD researchers and early career researchers. So again, those of you in these stages of your careers that might be considering an approach to fantasy text or fantasy theory, this is also a venue you might want to consider. There's a lot more that I could mention. As I said at the beginning, this is a brief presentation and we're only sort of scratching the surface of what the Centre has been doing the last few years. Again, please feel free to look at our website for more information on a number of other projects and initiatives. My co-director, Professor Matthew Sangster, will take over sort of chairing the rest of this session. and I'm sure there will be an opportunity at the end to ask questions. Meanwhile, thank you everyone for listening, and I hope this has been a useful introduction to our centre here in Glasgow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, virtual Dimitra. I guess I better take over. I'm just going to talk very briefly about a couple of projects the centre's been doing that I've been doing that have come out this autumn. I'll just bridge into that by saying one more thing about those perspectives on fantasy series. Something that we were very keen to do with that is make sure that the books don't just go into academic libraries, but are more widely accessible. So in the series contract, Bloomsbury are obligated to release the books in paperback for under £30 within I think it's 18 months actually as an original publication. The ebook price drops to match at that point. So the idea is that these are books that should be of interest to fans and to individuals as well as to the shelves of scholarly libraries. So we want to make sure that that's possible. I'm just going to talk very briefly then about three things. I'm now going to need to reshare something different. So this hopefully will come across okay. So I'm going to just show 3 slides about 3 things. The first is the book that I published in September, which is called An Introduction to Fantasy. As you can see here, the cover was painted by one of our former students at the University of Glasgow. I'm very pleased with it. And this is, as it says, an introductory book on fantasy, but also a book that presents hopefully some new research perspectives. I wanted to expand on what had been discussed as fantasy in 3 main directions in this book. One was to think about the longer histories of fantasy and thinking that while sort of older works, classical works, medieval works featuring impossible things would not have been considered in exactly the way we consider fantasy now, if we are reading them, we are often reading them back through the lens of fantasy. So they have been sort of transformed into fantastic context, and they're the source texts for much modern fantasy. The other was to think of fantasy as not just a form that happens in books. There's a lot of very good books about fantasy that only really focus on fantasy literature, and I wanted to broaden out to think about games and films and television and all the other forms that fantasy exists in. And I also wanted to discuss fantasy as a community rather than just a canon of works. So thinking about its fan cultures, its transactions, and those sorts of things, which I think are particularly important in fantasy as a genre. It's a form that borrows a lot more from older works, that thinks obsessively about its histories in all sorts of ways, and that has a kind of, I think, at its best, an open and collaborative sense of that it's a shared body of resources from which you can take things out and transform them and return them, thereby moving the genre forward and providing something new for others to transform in turn. So this came out with Cambridge. There is a paperback for £20, which is, I hope, relatively reasonable. There's an introduction and 6 chapters. The first talks about fantasy and language. The second talks about why it is good that fantasy repeats and returns to things. The third chapter thinks about the root forms of fantasy. The fourth thinks about fantasy versus realism, or fantasy's positioning as being anti-enlightenment and the problems with that positioning and what fantasy gains by opposing certain kinds of totalization. There's a chapter on world building, and there is a chapter on communities at the end. There is also an index that I spent quite a lot of time compiling, which probably no one will ever really use in great detail, but that's one of the things we didn't have in the book. The other thing that we've been working on as a centre for 4 years at this point is the big fantasy exhibition that Anthony mentioned at the British Library, which opened on Friday the 27th, the day after the British Library suffered a major cyber attack that knocked out all of its digital presence. But the exhibition, I believe, is still doing well. The reviews have been very good so far, and people have been going along and enjoying it. So if you are in London, then do try and go along. It's the first time I think that Ursula Le Guin's manuscripts have been shown outside the United States. We've borrowed some very cool Tolkien material. The British Library, of course, has amazing manuscript and rare book holdings. So we're showing sort of Kelmscott Press books. We're showing parts of the Angela Carter and Mervyn Peake archives. And we're showing Gawain and the Green Knight. We've got Beowulf in there, right next, the original Beowulf manuscript, right next to Game of Thrones, with Needle suspended above it. Fortunately, far enough back that it's not going to sort of Damocles like destroy the Beowulf manuscript more than it was already destroyed in the Ashburnham fire. We've also been able to borrow some amazing things. We've borrowed Neil Gaiman's Coraline notebook. We've borrowed ballet costumes from the Royal Opera House. We've borrowed LARP costumes from fans. So it's a really, I think, interesting and multimedial exhibition that sort of explores fantasy used in the way that the British Library's amazing collections let you get sort of deeper into the roots, but also showing sort of really new and cutting edge stuff, and showing games and films and other kinds of fantasy alongside the manuscripts and books that you would expect of a library-based exhibition. So that will be open in London until the 25th of February. If you cannot get to London, once the British Library website is up, do look at the events programme, which is accessible from anywhere in the world, and has some amazing events coming up that have only briefly been announced because of the website going down. There's a brilliant Susanna Clarke and Alan Moore in conversation event coming up. There is an N.K. Jemisin event. Neil Gaiman is there in a couple of weeks' time. Quite a lot of the talks that have happened already are available for free through the British Library's Living Knowledge Network site. So you can see there's an amazing launch talk with Susan Cooper in conversation with Natalie Haynes, and then with Simon McBurney and Robert Farley, who did the recent radio adaptation of The Dark is Rising. So do check that out. And then the other thing that we've done in relation to the exhibition, which I was a co-curator on, but lots of people in the centre fed into the exhibition. We workshopped it with students and colleagues, and several other people from the centre, including Dimitra, including Rob Masland, who set up the Centre for Fantasy and Fantastic and the programme originally, including Lucy, who will speak in a bit, have chapters in this essay collection on the, which is released in association with the exhibition. It's very heavily illustrated. You can see here the amazing Sveta Dorosheva key art for the exhibition, which is used extensively right through the book. There's a whole lot of other amazing fantasy images there, a whole lot of amazing fantasy writers. There's a preface by Neil Gaiman. You've got Alan Vandermeer on the weird. You've got Terry Windling on fairy tales. Got an amazing essay by Sophia Samatar on epic fantasy. That is a truly astonishing piece of writing. I really recommend that you check out. But this should be available through, well, I'm not sure whether all good bookshops. I'm sure there are some good bookshops that don't stock it, but hopefully the finest bookshops and your internet suppliers. So I think that's probably enough from me, sort of talking about research more generally. So we're going to have a series of presentations now from students at the centre, but first our new colleague at the centre, Dr. Will Tattersall. So Will, if you're ready to take over, please go ahead.
Yeah, of course. Are you hearing me okay?
That's all good. Coming through
yeah,
loud
good.
and clear.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk only briefly, and I'm going to start with an apology because some guys just started building scaffolding outside the window of the room I'm in. So there might be some clunking coming in on the microphone. I do apologize for that. I've only got one picture for you, which I'm going to show you here. I hope you can see that. This is called a dinosauroid, the thing on the left. And what it is it's a hypothetical descendant of the thing on the right. The thing on the right is called Stenonychosaurus. It's a dinosaur from the late Cretaceous of Alberta in Canada. And one of the guys who was responsible for naming it and discovering it in the 1970s came up with this thought experiment, which was basically, what if the asteroid didn't hit and the dinosaurs survived, kept evolving? What would they look like? So he created, with the sculptor once again, this creature on the left, the dinosauroid. Okay, so this is lovely and this is insane. You might have seen this before. I don't know. Is it a reasonably famous picture? It still occasionally crops up in the tabloid press in England, at least, because some people misinterpret this as a serious idea that these creatures are actually out there. It's not, of course. It's a work of the imagination, but it's a work of the imagination that takes place in a specifically pseudo-scientific vein, and that's what I'm interested in as a scholar. I write about the relationship between the fantastic imagination and scientific practice. This is a great example of that, because you can't have this creature until you've got really, really solid scientific knowledge. And Dale Russell is, at the time he creates this, one of the two foremost vertebrate paleontologists in Canada, which is where a lot of dinosaurs are discovered. He's right at the top of his game, one of the most eminent people in his field, and here he is doing something that looks like, the creature from the Black Lagoon. Now, Russell never explicitly acknowledged a fantastical or science fictional influence over anything that he was doing here. Actually, the influence he acknowledges in his personal correspondence is that of Carl Sagan, who kind of comes up with the thought experiment of the intelligent dinosaur descendant in one of his books in the 1970s, which cites Russell's own research into dinosaur intelligence. But even if there's no science fiction in the recipe for this creature, and we might have cause to doubt that if we've ever seen Doctor Who, for example, there's certainly science fiction and fantasy in the cultural aftermath of this creature, who then turns up in all sorts of fictional and non-fictional places across the 1980s and 90s. So the work that I do is about science and fantasy, and is about kind of understanding these scientific ideas are dependent upon an imagination that is not necessarily held by everyone to be in contradiction with the idea of creating empirical knowledge about the deep past or about any other aspect of the universe. The overall argument is that in order to have a truly graspable scientific picture of how the world works, you actually need to be good at making things up, even though that sounds like a contradiction. So paleontologists at the time didn't like the dinosaur very much. They thought it was dangerously science fictional and would create false impressions about the reliability of their own discipline. They were right, it must be said. The thing is taken up by cranks almost immediately, and Russell had to distance himself from the idea pretty quickly. But in more recent years, criticism of the dinosauroid has ended up focusing more on its anthropocentric bias, this idea that inevitably something good that survived would converge on a bipedal figure, which sort of walks erect like a human with binocular vision and large cranial capacity and all the rest of it. So there's a human bias in the model as well. Nevertheless, it starts a lot of conversations the more you think about it, about inevitability and destiny, about the human form, about religion, which is a major subtext for Russell, who's a Roman Catholic, and about lots of other things. The last thing I'll say about it, for me, is that the whole discussion about the dinosauroid on the left completely elides the discussion that we should be having, which is about the Stenonychosaurus on the right. Now that's putatively a normal, real animal, but of course that model is just as much a projection and just as dependent upon human imagination as the model on the left. It's just that we're not used to having to think about it that way. So that's the thing I'm working on at the moment. Dinosaurs are completely imaginary. They're also real, and how they work is tied up in how science works, but it's also tied up in the history of how fantasy is received both by scientists and the wider public. Okay, I think that's 5 minutes. I will stop there. Hopefully that kind of gives you a taste of the sort of thing I get up to, and I'll hand over back to Matt.
Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Lucinda Holdsworth, who I think will be talking to us about dark and terrifying things based on her doctorate on Lucifer. Go ahead, Lisa.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. As Matt says, I'm Dr. Lucinda Holdsworth. I'm very recently doctored, so I'm going to be talking today about my PhD project, which is called The Use and Abuse of Lucifer in Contemporary Literary Culture. Now, there's a lot of strands to this project, and given the time constraints, I can't cover everything, so I'm just going to give a brief overview of one of the most important concepts that I work with, which is something that I call satanic othering. So first, I'll explain what I mean by this. Then I'll explain why I think it's important to the study. And finally, I'll show how this links to contemporary fantasy media. So first of all, what is satanic othering? At its most basic, satanic othering is a mechanism by which any treatment of the disenfranchised can be justified. It's a convenient rhetorical tool that creates and spurs on moral panics. It instigates violence towards outgroups by encouraging members of the public to believe that their violence will protect the innocent and the vulnerable. Because it encourages violence towards the disenfranchised, is one of the mechanisms by which the privileged maintain their power. And it's routinely levelled against those who are seen to act above their station or outgroups who are thought to have become too visible. It requires two things: First of all, you need a perceived innocent victim, usually white Christian women and children. This is usually a hypothetical woman or child rather than an actual individual. The second thing you need is a scapegoat, who can, however tangentially, be linked to the devil in public consciousness. Now all you have to do is claim loudly that your satanic scapegoat probably wants to harm your innocent victim because they're either inherently satanic or they're a devil worshipper, and that's what all devil worshippers want. Once you have this rhetoric in place, you can justify any amount of violence against your scapegoat because you're seen to be protecting the vulnerable from someone who's acting on behalf of the most evil being that there is. Everything you do becomes morally unquestionable. Now, this is not a new phenomenon. European Christians have used this tactic for hundreds of years to justify violence rooted in anti-Semitism, racism, homophobia, misogyny, but particularly misogynoir, and many other forms of violence that I've not listed here. So why is satanic othering important? Well, this rhetoric shows up in our lives at every level. In my research, I examined the use of this rhetoric on an interpersonal level, in the kinds of justifications that have been used by some Christian parents who want to beat the devil out of their children in an attempt to save what they see as an innocent child hiding underneath Satan's influence. But this also goes to the highest levels of our society, and my research also explores political use of this rhetoric. For instance, the use of satanic othering by the Bush administration after 9/11 to justify the invasion of Iraq and the mounting civilian casualties that followed. Essentially, it's important because you can't see how you're being manipulated towards anger and violence if you don't know the mechanisms behind it. Now, I'm sure none of you here today are prone to the kind of overblown mob rule that this rhetoric caused in, say, the satanic panic of the 1980s. However, this rhetoric can still be dangerous and we can still get caught up in it. Even if you don't believe in the devil, if you hear enough claims that someone's a Satanist and likes sacrificing babies, you're still going to be predisposed against them unless you see where this pattern is going. We may not enact the violence ourselves, but we might be less likely to stand up and stop it happening if we don't look deeper. So, bring it all together, how is this related to contemporary fantasy media? In the last 40 years, fantasy creators have been using the devil as never before to explicitly engage with this rhetoric. In my research, I explore the ability of satanic fantasy texts to lay bare these abuses of power, to illuminate the mechanisms and logic of satanic othering, and to totally refute its legitimacy. From explorations of child abuse in Neil Gaiman's Sandman, to Aliette de Bodard's depiction of Christian colonialism in Dominion of the Fallen, or the CW's Supernatural's depiction of the war between heaven and hell, using the language of the Bush administration post 9/11, contemporary fantasy creators are using the devil to reveal the interpersonal and political harm that can be caused by satanic association, or at least by perceived satanic association. Fantasy allows this rhetoric to be unmasked in a way that is understandable and easily consumable. So by studying fantasy devils, we see not only the ways in which we have been manipulated, we might even learn to avoid it next time. I wish I could spend more time discussing this with you, but I think I'm just about reaching the end of my 5 minutes. So thank you very much for listening. If anyone wants to discuss this further, please do get in touch. I love to talk about the devil, any opportunity I get. So thank you once again, and I'll pass you back to Matt.
Thanks very much, Lucy. We come now to a duo of Tolkienists, the first of whom is Dr. Mariana Rios Maldonado. You can see they're sharing frame with Rita. Mariana, take it away whenever you're ready.
Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. So I'm going to talk about the main concern of my research, which focuses on the intersection between ethics and the construction of otherness in J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth narratives, such as The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion. For starters, in order to understand who is depicted or interpreted as the other in Tolkien's literary production, I consider who these texts position as the primary subject of the narrative. That is, who are the main characters and from which perspective the story is told. So The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings are quote-unquote Hobbit-centric examples, as they form part of the Red Book of the West March, and they're a historical account of Hobbit kind, whose protagonists are Frodo and Bilbo Baggins. Meanwhile, the Silmarillion and other tales from the wider legendarium serve as a cosmogonical account of Middle-earth from an elvish and human perspective. Thus, hobbits, humans, and elves constitute the main subjects or ideas of self in Tolkien's fictional world. I then propose two paths to approach the other in Tolkien's Middle-earth narratives. The first is based on the philosophical discourse of French thinker Emmanuel Levinas. For Levinas, everyone who is not ourselves is the other. I therefore analyze encounters between different characters who represent different ideas of selfhood of the peoples of Middle-earth. Encounters such as those between the hobbits Merry and Pippin and the Ent Treebeard, or between the human Faramir and the hobbits Frodo and Sam, are prime examples of my research's main interest. The second path looks towards figures who, by problematizing and diverging from the narrative's primary idea of self, are considered other. There are creatures in Middle-earth who, through their evil nature and quintessential opposition to the narrative's main characters, are constructed as other, such as Morgoth, Sauron, the Ringwraiths, orcs, goblins, Shelob, and so on. Simultaneously, there are beings whose embodiment of difference contrasts with the primacy of masculinity and whiteness in Tolkien's literary production, and therefore either reflect real-world power structures in these works of fiction or even challenge them. Collectively, the Swarthimen, the Haradrim or Southrons, and Easterlings, with their apparent tendency towards evil and swart or sallow skin, are juxtaposed to the seeming goodness and whiteness of the three houses of men in the first age, Numenor in the second age, Gondor and Rohan in the third. As for an individual example, Éowyn stands as an other amidst the male leaders of her people, the male Eored of the Rohirrim, and the male soldiers at the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Finally, there are characters who through their choices and actions are rendered as other. Smeagol becomes the other called Gollum thanks to his exposure to the One Ring, and Saruman others himself through his pursuit of power. At the same time, Bilbo and Frodo Baggins are othered by their own community due to their queerness or nonconformity with Hobbit normativity. Their fairy blood, their association with magical crizzards like wizards and elves, sorry about that, and their departure from the Shire in search of adventure or as part of a perilous task. In order to address the wide spectrum of otherness present in Tolkien's Middle-earth narratives, my research complements Emmanuel Levinas' philosophical insights with a range of theoretical lenses that touch upon the idea of the other. These include Sigmund Freud's concept of the uncanny, Julia Kristeva's abject, as well as insights drawn from critical race theory, gender theory, and postcolonial theory. Levinas posits that the encounter with the other is the cornerstone of ethics. My main objective is therefore to elucidate how the encounters between the self and the other in Tolkien's Middle-earth narratives affect the ethics of their characters. That is, the way of their acting, the way of being, and how ethics ultimately affects the stories in themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariana. We'll continue with the Tolkien theme by asking Tom Emanuel to speak next. Tom, if you can appear and reveal your presentation to us, that'd be wonderful.
I certainly can. Thank you all. One moment. I'm going to share my screen right quick and talk about, can folks see this? Is that?
Yeah, well, that's all good.
Brilliant. All right. So I'm going to go back and put it on. So I'm going to talk about my PhD research, which is currently titled The Tale We've Fallen Into, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, Fandom, and the Post-Christian Quest for Meaning. So in 2021, for the first time ever, fewer than half of English and Welsh declared themselves Christian, while more than a third declared themselves non-religious. Similarly, a 2021 Gallup poll found that, again for the first time in history, fewer than 50% of Americans are active members of a religious community. My research explores how increasing numbers of atheists, agnostics, spiritual but not religious, and other so-called religious nones meet their needs for meaning-making and develop both individual and communal identities. I interrogate when and how popular texts come to play a quote-unquote religious role in the lives of non-religious people, using J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings as my case study. So I employ an interdisciplinary framework of sociology of religion, fan studies, autoethnography, progressive Christian theology, and Tolkien scholarship. That is, if you were counting 5 disciplines. And I hypothesize that non-religious narratives function religiously when and to the extent that they transcend the narrative frame. That is, when the story world ceases being merely a text which is subjected to interpretation and becomes itself an interpretive framework by which the reader constructs identity, finds community, and makes meaning with experience. I'll conduct a series of approximately 20 dialogic interviews with non-religious Tolkien fans to explore the role that The Lord of the Rings plays in their lives. Alongside these interviews, I will undertake a reflexive autoethnographic account of my own experience with the novel. And to give you a bit of a sense of its personal significance to me, my youngest child is named Ellie, as a shortening of the Eleanor flower, which is found in the books. It's also a good Jewish name, and his mom's Jewish, so it all works out. My project fills a gap in the study of Tolkien and religion and intervenes directly in ongoing conflict in my field by centering the diversity of fan reception rather than putative, quote-unquote, authorial intent. I seek to lift up the voices of underrepresented and oft marginalized fans who've increasingly suffered abuse at the hands of a reactionary, indeed white supremacist Christian contingent within the discipline and within Tolkien fandom at large, mirroring broader cultural battles over race and religion. This project will likewise contribute to the wider theory and practice of emerging spiritual communities in the pluralistic, increasingly post-Christian religious landscape of the increasingly postmodern West. And I thought it would probably be worth pointing out that the center is co-sponsoring with the Tolkien Society, the UK Tolkien Society, a seminar on Tolkien and religion in the 21st century on Sunday, the 26th of November, so just in 2 weeks' time. It's fully online. It is fully free to sign up. You can find the URL there at the bottom, or shoot this, the title of the seminar, into your favored search engine. And Will Sherwood, who's another PhD student here at the Center for Fantasy and the Fantastic, and I are co-organizing this between the center and the Tolkien Society. So if this is an interesting topic to you, I'd encourage you to come check out the really remarkable slate of presenters, including Mariana will be co-presenting with Taylor Driggers, another center person, and a couple of other center people will be involved as well. So thank you very much for listening. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we'll pass it back off to Matt. Thanks, folks.
Thanks very much, Tom. And last but by no means least, Marita Aveniti. If you've been paying attention, you will have seen a number of times on the slides that Dimitra was introducing, due to her long association with the Centre, coming in the Master's Programme. Marita will be talking about fantasy and theatre, I believe.
Hello, everyone. I will try to keep this short and slightly coherent, which, as everyone knows who has spoken to me, neither of them are my strong suits. So we're playing to our weaknesses today. So my project is called Other Worlds on Stage, the Interweaving Dramaturgies of Fantasy Theatre. And my research uses a dramaturgical lens to examine the representation of theatre in what I call fairy fantasies. That is, fantasy novels that feature fairy as an independent, separate land, and that are primarily concerned with fairies' relationship and interactions with the human world. Because I love being exciting, and nothing is more exciting than a nice schema, I propose the following sort of map to understanding those interactions. So you can either have humanity as playwrights writing fairy into theater, into a play. You can have humanity as a theatrical audience and fairy as the actors or theater makers. And you can have humanity as performers and fairy acting as the most beloved of all categories, the theater critic. For my case studies, I have chosen texts in which those relationships are textually explicit and theatre exists within the text as a praxis. However, I propose that theatre can also be read into all sorts of fairy fantasy texts as a metaphor through a theatricality that is inherent in the subgenre's representation of fairy. So through my proposed schema and its applications, I attempt to showcase that each of those types of interaction can reveal a lot of things about our own, and that is our own humanity, our own as humanity or as readers, relationship to fairy and the fantastic more generally. When I was trying to think about some way to present my work in 5 minutes, I kept returning to one of my big methodological inspirations. Again, nothing sexier than a conference talk about methodology. And this was a game studies paper by Lane Nooney called A Pedestal, a Table, a Love Letter, Archaeologies of Gender in Video Game History, that I read entirely by accident at the first year of my PhD. They describe their work as being more like a speleology than an archaeology, something that gropes towards its limits instead of a clear excavation that brings objects into the light of knowledge. Spelunking, they argue, is a phenomenologically imprecise encounter that lets us hollow out a space that relies on non-continuity and the inability to apprehend the historical field in its wholeness. Now, there was something about this paper and the ideas that it discussed that really spoke to me across academic disciplines and gave me the words to express something that was and still is at the core of my work. I believe that it is important to remember always that our gaze is incomplete, full of gaps and absences. It's not an accident that so many of us wear glasses, and I think we should not forget the metaphorical significance of that fact when studying. Which leads me back to my research. As I said, I'm examining fairy in theatre, and I'm looking at either 5 or 7 texts that are all written by female authors: Elizabeth Bear, Pamela Dean, Greer Gilman, Kat Howard, and Diana Wynne-Jones. This was originally an accident that turned into a conscious, deliberate choice to focus my analysis on women's writing and women's editing, and on fantasy books that are not the kind to usually show up in chronologies and summaries of the genre's history. I focus on texts that are often under-discussed and underappreciated, and I get to nod a lot when people ask me, "Oh, but have you read Neil Gaiman? He talks about a similar thing." And I get to say, "Ah, yes, tell me about that." So yes, I have completely lost track of time, as is my wont. So I'm going to end quickly with another thing to remember from that Nooney paper, which is history is not what we talk about, but in how we organize its meaning, and where we choose to focus our gaze as scholars of the fantastic has a lot of power and is not just a question of what's more important or more significant. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rita. Anthony, do we hand back over to you at this point? I think that's the end of our speakers. Thank you all in the room for listening. We're happy to take questions if questions can be communicated to us. Can I summon my fellow panelists to appear so that you can have questions directly to our faces?
So, well, first of all, a round of applause for all speakers, because it's been wonderful. We thank you all for the brief introduction to the Center of Fantasy and the Fantastic and some samples of the work carried out there, which shows how the center supports new approaches and wider definition of fantasy. So before we start with the questions, I would just like you to highlight how can students contact you and where they can find out more about all these free events that are put together by the center.
So I think if you Google Glasgow Centre for Fantasy, you will come to the pages that Dimitra was showing. There are various bits of the fantasy site. They all cross-link to each other. So you can find out what the centre's doing there. You can reach most of us pretty straightforwardly by email. I think most of us are in English, although Mariana is in comparative literature, but we have listings on the university pages. Addresses are also very easy to guess. They're just usually first name dot last name at glasgow.ac.uk.
Thank you. So now, if anyone would like to ask any questions about the research or more specific questions about the programs, visiting the center, etc. Yes, there's a question there.
Oh, good. I was worried we'd been comprehensive.
Hello. Thank you to all of you for your short, very concise, very illustrative presentations. My question, I guess it's a little bit for everyone, specifically for Will, because I know you work on museology and interdisciplinary work. So I was wondering how you approach interdisciplinary research in general. I asked quite a similar question yesterday about a presentation on music and literature. So how you approach research that delves into the most scientific or like other disciplines that maybe you are not as confident or as aware of, since you from your literary studies background, I mean, because I attempt to do something similar. So thank you.
Thank you. That's a really lovely question. And I need about 2 hours to answer it. Let me see what I can do. Look, it's really tough. Interdisciplinarity is one of those things that everyone says that they want on conferences, in job ads, and I think most of them actually don't want it. I think they're lying to themselves, because real interdisciplinarity is awkward and frustrating for virtually everybody involved, and the rewards are not always obvious. I actually try to remember, this is my way through it, others exist, that I'm not interdisciplinary. Actually, I'm a literary critic. That's my training, and pretending that I know anything about the history of art or philosophy or paleontology does a massive disservice to those disciplines and also to my own expertise. So what I try and do, my personal way through this, is I try and involve myself in multidisciplinary conversations as often as I can. I talk to paleontologists and geologists, and getting those relationships of trust across the two culture divide is really difficult. It takes ages, and often requires you to sort of challenge yourself and some of the assumptions that have been drilled into you. I don't think you can just go through life in a sort of complete and deliberate ignorance of what the other disciplines are doing. And everything I write, I try to be responsible to science and to history as well. But also to remember that the perspective I bring as a literary critic is unique and important, and to celebrate that and put that in the front, because that's where my, I suppose, relative uniqueness lies. But look, it sucks, right? We are encouraged to bifurcate ourselves in this way, and it's a way that it's a way that's built into the logistics of how a university works. So these barriers are conceptual, but they're not only conceptual, they're also actually they're practical, and getting across them is really, really, really hard. Since I arrived in Glasgow last January, I've been trying to set up conversations with scientists up here because I want to build some connections in Scotland. I moved up from England at the start of the year. I barely even managed coffee with people yet. It takes so long to get people to give you a minute. That's a ramble. I'm so sorry, and it's longer even than I wanted it to be, but this huge subject. Whatever you're up to with it, good luck. It's horrible. Read Clifford Geertz, read Willem McCarthy, and find your own way through it, but it's really, really difficult.
Thank you so much
If
for
I
that
can-
answer.
If I can pop in with the sort of opposite, but not opposite experience to Will's, which is that I am standing here all bifurcated. I'm a theatre studies. I'm trained in theatre with a much more practical sort of education in my undergrad, and then I moved into English literature expecting them to be the same thing. And did you know they're not? Did you know this is actually two different disciplines? And the thing I want to sort of highlight is that throughout this journey, you will have moments where your two expertises are going to clash, and almost the knowledge that you have from each space is going to cancel each other out. I spent 3 months at the beginning of my PhD learning that I'm using the word theatre wrong, and I actually mean a different thing. That is completely independent term, and so on and so forth. And then I had to explain my way and sort of find a way to express myself in a way that was understood by both disciplines, and to use the knowledge that I had from theater studies about performance and performativity and what I mean when I say those words. And no, yes, I have read Judith Butler, but it's a more complicated conversation. So I was going to say it is a very is occasionally a source of a lot of imposter syndrome, and a lot of people will tell you don't know what you're talking about because you're using expertise from your other discipline. But just remember that you are doing this work and no one knows what you're talking about better than you. You might have to find different ways to express it at some point, but you do have the knowledge. And, you know, just because you don't know exactly how to phrase things in an English literature invisible script way doesn't mean that you don't know what you're talking about. That's it.
So finally, I know, Matt, that you want to leave, but this is a question for everyone, but specifically aimed at Matt. I've been trying to highlight, and I think the presentation has shown this quite well, this broader approach towards fantasy that the Centre is trying to promote. You've been providing some samples here today, but could you speak a little bit more about that briefly?
Well, I can see someone in the audience with the microphone, so I don't have to go so immediately that we can't take that question afterwards if we would like to. But I will just speak to Andrew's point very quickly, and I think it's mainly, I mean, it's mainly about just gathering people here trying to create as wide an umbrella for them as possible. Like, I think it comes in some ways back to the interdisciplinarity question, that sort of we position ourselves as literary critics, but I'm a dreadful medievalist. I don't know a lot about the mid-Victorian period. I'm a fairly indifferent modernist, so I'm not a literary critic. And that by saying I'm a literary critic, that doesn't mean I know everything about English literature. I know about my quite specific areas and fields within it, and then I have some interdisciplinary fields that sit alongside it. And I think it's partly sort of realizing that if you're being interdisciplinary, you're not trying to master all of those fields in full. You're making choices about what knowledge is important for you, but also making choices about the communities that you place yourself in, about who you're in conversation with. So I am a reasonable Tolkienist, but I'm nowhere near as good as Dimitra. But Dimitra is sort of in an office in a nearby building. If I want to know about certain things of Tolkien, Dimitra can introduce me to those sorts of things. So I think that's really and similarly with my students, like when we're sort of working with Lucy, I've thought about satanic literature in all sorts of ways that I never thought about. Similarly with ethics and Marianne, and with pretty much everyone else in this conversation. Will and I know each other from when we were both PhD students, and Will organised a genre fiction reading group that really set me on the path to being a scholar of fantasy and genre. So I think it's partly about being in those communities, and that's really the sort of the trick of the centre is this one, is just like putting up this banner and saying we're interested in fantasy here, and then being initially, in Rob's case, I think quite surprised that so many people wanted to come along, but once they did, just trying to build and nurture that community.